So, good morning, Liz.
Morning.
Let's kick this off with something light and fun. So, business cliches, we hear them every day. Some are good, some are bad, but all are rooted in a bit of truth. Which ones would you say are relevant for your brands and ones that you talk about in meetings every day?
So a favorite for me is talking about the elephant in the room, or as my team would say, put the fish on the table. Surface the smelliest, most problematic thing that nobody really wants to talk about, and let's just really talk about it and surface it. For us, a lot of times that's permission space. Let's be real about what our audience wants from us, what they believe from us. Let's meet them where they're at.
Wonderful. And let's quick fire through it. So, how about pushing the envelope?
Pushing the envelope. So for me, one of my favorite developments in social media is really pushing the envelope of the role of the social team and seeing more of a confluence between talent and social team, a lot more of like social on camera, really seeing like young talent be willing to like be courageous, put their own face on stuff and show up as themselves.
Wonderful. And how about low-hanging fruit?
Low-hanging fruit. I really like this one because in my work, my team is totally focused on reputation, and often there's a drive to go after the absolute hardest part of the audience, the people who really can't be convinced, which typically is not our best use of resources, is like, let's really focus on the don't know no opinions, the people who haven't gotten that exposure. Let's bring in the people that are going to be the most open to engaging with us. And so that's one that I think often takes like a fresh strategic eye to say what's really the best way we can show up and make a difference here.
Wonderful, thank you. And how about we get to the meat of the conversation? So how do Nestlé and its brands think about sustainability?
So for us, for a long time, I think sustainability, but particularly climate action, has been a real business imperative. And I think that's true particularly for food companies, both in terms of the impact that food has on climate, but also what climate change is going to do to our ability to get ingredients. Very pragmatic. I think it's a newer journey that we're going on to really say, but what makes our sustainability consumer relevant? How do we make this connective with an audience as opposed to just what does technical excellence look like? So I think that's been a more recent journey for the company, but one that's really started to catch some momentum and I think change some ways of working with senior leaders.
So you mentioned connecting with your customer. Like, how do you go about that? How do you make sure that the customer who's buying your coffee beans, for example, knows that there's a sustainable journey to get to their mug in the morning?
Yeah, I think a lot of times we start with this question is, do people know? Why people are always surprised? Why don't more people know what we're doing? And actually, it's been a really important change for us to say, like, have we given them a reason to care? Have we given them a reason that this is really relevant to them? And that's required, I think, reducing risk aversion on our part. So in one example, we used to be really afraid to show up next to something negative. So contextual targeting, things like that, we don't want to show up on an article about how plastic pollution is surging and this is a major problem. That's so negative, we don't want to be associated with that. The reality is when our consumer is reading that kind of article, that's when they're feeling motivated. That's when they want to take action and they're the most like engaged on that issue and feeling passionate. That's where we should show up and not just say, here's how we're transforming packaging, but actually give them a way to be a part of it. Give them a way in their purchases or through our nonprofits or through reaching out to their own government representatives, give them a way that they can take action in those moments they're feeling the most motivated. But that requires some willingness to show up in tough, negative conversations, which has not always been the case for sure.
And so obviously, tough, negative conversations, all of these sorts of things, they're difficult, but they're very rewarding. What are some things that you and your team have done over the last few years that you would say you're most proud of?
Yeah, there's a project that my team worked on last year that actually came out of a partnership at Cannes with the Vox team. And when it comes to Nestlé, we want to be realistic about our permission space. We know that not every consumer feels like they want a big corporation to show up and teach them something. This is not always the role or the credibility that they see from us. And so partnering with Vox, who has a ton of credibility through the Explainer series on really teaching and opening and giving like compelling, understandable explanations on complex topics, was a big step for us. So we partnered on a climate jargon explainer. And we started from the question is, when you see climate promises from brands or companies, how do you know what's credible? How do you understand the terms that are being used? And we wanted to be able to use ourselves as a best practice example and say, here's what to look for that really matters. And that was an opportunity to show up with a partner who could open the door to audience interest. And really, we blew away benchmarks on that from an audience attention perspective. But most importantly to us, we could really show that consumers of that content changed their perception of Nestlé as a climate leader. So we were able to drive that kind of explainer approach, which wouldn't have been as appropriate from us alone, really came from being with a partner who was known for that, but really changed the perception and the understanding of where we're showing up on climate action.
Okay, wonderful. And so you say partnering with different people has been a big shift for you. How else has it changed for your brand in the last couple of years, and where do you perhaps see sustainability going in the future?
Yeah, I think I'm crazy about the changes that the consumer has made on how they see sustainability in even the last 2 years. We're not even talking about the massive changes of the last decade, but I can tell you a couple of years ago, the absolute best performing message we could show up for with most consumers was, we're planting 14 million trees this year. Great, planting trees, everybody loves it. But this year, that hasn't gone away 100%, but we're actually seeing the top performing message that we show up with when it comes to deforestation is that we're working with local farmers and indigenous communities on how you protect forests, which is maybe doesn't have that big reporting spike to it, but consumers are responding to that more because I think consumers more than ever understand that there's a connection between people and planet, and that you really need to serve both to be effective, that the social environmental are not really separate. And so we're actually seeing consumers look for a much more nuanced take on what sustainability projects look like, on how brands get involved in sustainability, that they're looking for something more complex and integrated. And I'm talking lay consumer. I'm not talking when you filter to high income or socially conscious. Lay consumer, we're seeing this move towards complexity and towards this idea of equity and justice that ties to sustainability that I think opens up a really compelling conversation that's exciting. I think that the worst thing we can do is underestimate our consumer on this. They don't always need the simplest message. They need you to show up and be credible and really come through. But they don't need you to quote unquote dumb it down. They really want to get into the meat of a lot of this intervention.
Wonderful. And so you mentioned kind of messaging to the consumer. Is that what you would say is the biggest challenge, or are there other things that you at Nestlé are facing that you've got to think about?
Yeah, I think our major challenge on my team has a lot to do with scale. So if you're not familiar with Nestlé, we're in more than 180 countries, which, as you can imagine, is a little hard to game plan for from a content and messaging perspective. But we have locally embedded teams. In many ways, we're kind of I would say, like, world's biggest local food company, because when it comes to how we show up in East Africa, how we show up in Latin America, ton of local sourcing, local staff, different brands that are relevant locally. What that means in a job like mine is that your question isn't just what's the global story we're telling, but how do you make that local story the strongest it can be? Because that's what most of your consumers are really getting. And that's really difficult in a structure like ours. How do you build capabilities in 80 fragmented teams at once? So that's by far our biggest challenge. And I think what we've seen is that we need to move towards putting more trust and investment in our local teams. They get the job done. And we need to really focus on capabilities there. But it's not easy because there are really different needs, different levels of resourcing. And there are plenty of times that we look at the landscape and say, oh my God, this is an impossible task. But you chip away at it and you come back to that belief in what local teams can do and can be effective at. And when you lead with that, they will buy into you more.
And so you mentioned 180 different countries. That's obviously incredibly difficult to kind of navigate and think about. How do you make sure that Nestlé stays authentic and consistent in their messaging when it comes to either sustainability or diversity?
Yeah, this is a really tough one, and usually we talk about our sustainability ABCs: authenticity, boldness, consistency. And if Melissa's here, Melissa Anderson from Public Good, this is something that came out of a partnership of ours, and that's what we try to go back to. I think a lot of that authenticity comes from consistency, comes from long-term investment, making progress in the same topic, deep partnerships. with local NGOs who are really doing this work on the ground, and staying consistent on that topic over time. There will be times that the market is surging or running after something for relevance, for consumer interest, but brands are losing their core. And they're not asking, who am I? How do I show up? They're saying, oh, the consumer is here. This year, we're going to entirely focus on this. Next year, we've gone over here, as opposed to really finding how their own brand is relevant. So for us, it really comes good food, good life. It really comes down to food as an agent of change. Food as an agent of change for you in your culture, in the way you bond with people around you, in your own health. Also an agent of change for whole systems and countries and economies and certainly the planet. So I think for us, it really comes down to food. Where's the relevance to food? And how do we show up as a provider of really good food in every way? So constantly driving back to, is this relevant to us? Are we making the connection to what's really important? And are our local teams showing up day in and day out and investing with the same partners rather than trend chasing? That, I think, has become the most important for us on our ABCs.
Okay, wonderful. And so for sustainability, I think you've kind of talked about that. In terms of diversity, I think we talked about how the conversation is changing, right? How internally at Nestlé are you having those conversations, and how do you think about having that consistent message in particularly that area?
Yeah, I think that's a huge factor for us. And of course, when you talk about so many countries, the factors that are driving diversity and equity conversations are really different. In the Middle East, in South Asia, in the US, really different conversations around diversity. I think the one important thing that we take is, who are the voices that we're bringing through when we talk about how we're showing up on these topics. And I can say in absolute candor that a few years ago, you might look for something even like our stories that really took from different actions around the world, and see entirely, white European faces telling that story, even if we were talking about deforestation in West Africa, even if we were talking about, working with farmers in South Asia. And so it was a real paradigm shift for us to say, it's harder from where we sit to go and find the right messengers here, but we need to go to where the local credibility is and empower those local voices. You need a Cameroonian talking about what you're doing in the forest in West Africa to really be embedded in it, to really share that authentic on the ground story. And so that's been a big part of our shift, is going and finding those voices that own that work in a deeper way, which is tougher for a content team. A lot of the times it's not somebody you walk down the hall to, but it's really, really pays off and compounds over time to show that global breadth, but a real local credibility, to show up really grounded in the local realities of where you operate.
Cool. And how do you, is there any message you want people to take away in terms of how you're thinking about things? Are there questions that you have for the next stages and how you can further develop, I guess?
Yeah, I think a lot of the questions that I've gotten here has been sort of around the notion of marketing a parent brand, and what is a corporate brand, and what is that even supposed to do? And I think that when it comes to looking at the favorability towards your company, towards your parent brand or your corporate brand, it's a business imperative. I think we're here often looking at how we create connections with products or services with consumers, but that starts from a ground of really having trust in who you are. And the other thing that's absolutely critical that I think we have a lot of conversations here is the changing face of talent. And how do you bring the absolute best talent into your organization? And one thing that really requires is investing in your reputation. And so when you look at that idea of reputation communications, know that is absolutely critical and is driving business results, even if it's not what you see in the P&L quarter to quarter. And so that would be my biggest message, is invest in reputation, take your consumers seriously, and really meet them where they are and what they need to hear from you. And with reputation, it's not a fast road. You don't see a lot of spikes. It takes a real sustained investment over time to build that progress. But if you are showing up in the right way for your consumer, you will see that return, and it absolutely will impact your business.
Yeah. Reputation is one of those difficult things. It takes a very, very long time to build.
Yes.
You
but
don't
not
see
that much time to lose.
Yeah, exactly. And so I guess sustainability and diversity are a constant message. Are there any initiatives that you want to particularly highlight that you're working on in the next few months, or anything that your team are constantly thinking about?
I would say one topic that's come up already this week is looking at the sort of notion of sustainability and what does that include anymore. For us, we're incredibly focused on climate because we see a lot of urgency there. But it's not the only factor, and there's nothing that you can kind of show up in a vacuum. You have to really think about what's the impact you're having more broadly. So one of the stories we're focusing on with our partner Duke and Duck, who's here today, is really bringing to life more of the nature projects and seeing some of these things like restoring native species and what does this mean for an ecosystem and why would a business be doing that, I think is a really important question to answer and start showing up because just like we've seen the climate literacy really improve for consumers and them getting much more nuanced, we actually really need our consumers to engage in a more holistic way as well and to really embrace brands that are showing up in that way for their community, because that's what starts to really move the needle more collectively. So that's when we're really looking forward to focus on some of that integrated nature work in Australia and doing some restoration in really depleted forests and ecosystems. And again, it doesn't sound inherently like a super sexy or like commercial message. My team does a lot of 10-second assets, and it would really surprise you what we're trying to get through in 10 seconds. But it's one that we find increasingly important, and so my hope is that that's something we can bring through in a way that would really be thumb-stopping and make someone stop and think about different angles to sustainability than maybe they've looked at before.
Yeah. And so you've talked about the environment a lot. Are there other buckets that you're thinking about in terms of diversity, in terms of pride? Are there other things that are important to you in terms of broadening your brand's message?
Yeah, I think going back to that idea of good food, good life, and food as our North Star, I think it's really important to acknowledge that there are a lot of equity and justice issues in food. And hunger is not apolitical, while it may be something that is, generally emotional, generally well understood. It is something that really intersects with a lot of equity and community issues. And so a lot of our biggest partners are World Central Kitchen, for example, who folks might be familiar with. And they look at food as a solution and also as a rebuild. So how do you come in a moment of disaster and show up with food when people are in that moment of need? But also do it in a way that's going to rebuild that food system, that's going to empower local food businesses for a more sustained impact. And so when we look at that big picture of food and how is that showing up for consumers, how is that showing up for communities, I think that starting to look more in a more complex way at what's the system at play here? What role have we played in the system? Can we reckon with places where we're not having a positive impact, and can we fundamentally change that? I think it's become a really rich conversation for the organization, but we've also had some partners who really challenged us, and I mean that in a really positive way. So I think that we're getting into an era where large organizations are interrogating themselves much more in a way that can really help us look differently at the role we play in the system and making that dramatically different.
Yeah. I think one important thing is obviously that you're not getting everything right. You need to interrogate certain aspects. Do you have perhaps a framework for how you do that? Do you make sure that you get your senior leaders involved? How do you think about that aspect of it?
I think that's a really good question, and a lot of it does come back to partners. So we'll have a couple large global partners. We'll also have local partners. And I think that really opening the door for them to say, not just, here's how we need you to show up in this one intervention, but actually, here's the role we see companies like you and you playing more broadly. I think a lot of it comes from our partners, and it's sort of like you need a good enough friend to tell you the truth, right? So I think having partners who are really present on the ground and can bring a lot of candor about what's needed on the ground. To give one example, a major area of focus for us is in sourcing cocoa. So if the Americans in the room love Toll House chocolate chips or the Europeans love Kit Kats, this is a huge part of how we look at where those ingredients come from. And one of the things that we went to a few years back was, our solution is going to be we want everything certified. We want somebody to stamp and check and say this came from a responsible environment. And really quickly we figured out that's not a solve by itself. That may be a really valuable step, but that doesn't fundamentally look at issues in the communities we source from. And so about a year and a half ago, we launched a Living Income Accelerator program in Côte d'Ivoire, and that was basically how do we help every farmer we're sourcing from reach a living income. And it comes from actually paying them for sustainable and socially responsible practices, paying them to send their children to school, paying them to grow more sustainably, paying them to take practices on their field that will head off disease. And it was the first program that has ever been at this kind of scale and implemented by a company that's buying those ingredients. And one of the things we had to say was, we're gonna check our progress, and we're gonna transparently show how this is turning out. We're gonna have the pilot scale up, and we're gonna come out and say, you know what, in year one, we saw really good progress on adapting these practices. We're not seeing movement on these other things, and we're gonna make further changes. And again, that's a big cultural adjustment for a company to be comfortable to put the fish on the table and say that not everything we're doing is working. We need to go further. And we absolutely depend on partners who are really integrated in the communities full time. We have agronomists on staff, on Nestlé staff, but they're covering big regions. So it's the partners on the ground who come back and tell us what's working, and our ability to show up and actually share, even with consumer audiences, here's some stuff we're doing that is not working. We're changing. Here's more to come. I think is a new era for us. And that's a specific project where I think we've seen a lot of change, and being willing to move on from this idea that, like, well, if it's certified, why are there still problems? Well, there are still a ton of things going on in these communities that we have to embed closer to understand and really impact, and be willing to take that on as a company that's sourcing there.
Oh, wonderful. Unless there's any questions from the audience, how about we leave the audience with a... do you want to ask a question?
Hi, I'm Mandy. I work at media.net. My question for you, as coming from a tech standpoint, and I think it's amazing that you guys have, all this power on the ground. But when you're talking to your agencies and, you're developing this content and these digital strategies, how are you measuring success against these more niche initiatives where historically digital success is considered successful when it's scaling? And in this case, it's not a scale, success metric. It's an effective metric. And how is that being measured? And are you giving your agencies that training, and so they have the room and ability to keep partners on who are effectively reaching audiences? They might just not be massive, but they're correct.
I really love this question. This is absolutely like an ongoing balance for us. And our agencies, I think, have really needed to change for our work versus when they're working with, like, my colleagues at KitKat, who are measuring for something very different. And so there are a couple different things. I think we have gotten much more aggressive about defining our audiences up front. And that sounds really simple, but it was something that broke the measurement system for exactly that reason. If we didn't really do it properly in saying, who is the audience we want to see reputational movement from? And we focus a lot on basically like having a control group and measuring against a control group. So we want to know, when our content is reaching this audience, are we seeing that they're coming out of this campaign cycle with a different view of Nestlé than the segment of the audience who wasn't reached with this content? For us, that's our North Star, campaign to campaign. But we also need to see that sustained over time. So we take a smaller set of key countries that we do really deep favorability tracking at a population level, and we look, are some segments moving in the segments we're reaching at a population level, are they moving in the direction we want? And that's what I mentioned when I say reputation takes time. If we're running campaigns this year, we may or may not see that lift this year. We may need multiple years on track where we're starting to see campaign to campaign lift before we start to see population level lift. I would say in the US that probably took about 3 years to see the true population level outcomes and direction that we wanted to see. So for us, it's about triangulating between those two. How do we look versus a control group on any given content or campaign, but also how is sustaining that communication changing our population level metrics, which is definitely not easy, but we want to set that bar for ourselves, because otherwise I think we fall into a trap of saying, oh, reputation's hard to measure. Look over there and don't ask me how this really did. I think we have to be willing to show up and say sometimes this did not work. This did not move the needle with our audience. And if we don't say that, we'll never change the trajectory.
Hello. Is it working? Oh, amazing. Thank you for your question. Yeah, because I will kind of follow up the question you asked. In terms of the measurements that you do, do you mostly do them after the campaign is already done, or you measure something pre-test?
Yeah, we do both. Though I will say we have a much easier time seeing that result in a pre-test than we do after the live environment, right? So it becomes a little bit. Easy is strong, but if we actually are in a testing environment, we're commanding a lot more of our audience's focus. And it's often a given that we will see some degree of lift in a test environment because they're focused on it. And who wouldn't like to hear that, you're doing a sustainability program? Being able to duplicate that in a live environment is been harder for us. It's been less consistent for sure. And so we do pre-test and we'll compare for a given audience how they respond to even a little bit of a nuanced difference, a farmer support message versus renewable energy versus packaging, and that will inform how we go out into the live environment. But we are very, very cautious about attributing success based on the test results because it's that nuanced message can be really hard from a focus and attention perspective, and that's often where we lose that connective tissue.
Thank you. I hope we'll connect after the talk. Thanks for the answer.
Thanks.
So thank you, Liz. It sounds like you're going to get a host of questions after this.
Great.
But is there a final message you'd like to leave the audience with today?
Yeah, I think it's really interrogate how your reputation shows up for your consumers. Put the fish on the table. Be willing to meet consumers where they are, and be willing to make a really sustained, committed investment in reputation that goes with your true brand marketing. Because the two will really, really start to build on each other and compound in ways that will be great for your reputation, great for your business, great for attracting talent. It takes a sustained investment, but the rewards are there. And so I'm really excited to see more companies and brands moving in that direction. And I believe this is a group that can really further impact that and set a higher bar on how that communication shows up. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you for your time today, Liz. And we're all very excited to see how Nestlé continues to develop with you and your team at the forefront of things.
Thanks so
Thank you.
much.